This is Product Management. Welcome. We're here to learn from brilliant minds across numerous disciplines that fuel the modern product manager. Let's take a deep dive into user experience, innovation, design, development, metrics, and more. Do you want more product management tactics and research? Subscribe at thisisproductmanagement.com to receive the latest updates from this podcast.
Hey, I'm your host, Mike Fishbein. This is Product Management, a podcast produced by Alpha. Welcome back. On this episode, I'll be speaking with David Cancel, a serial entrepreneur, formerly the Chief Product Officer at HubSpot, and now the CEO of a company called Drift. He'll talk about how to structure product teams, why a culture focused on the customer is critical, and how autonomy can scale.
Hi, my name is David Cancel. I'm the CEO of Drift, and this is my fifth startup, and we are focused on, here at Drift, like several of my other companies, we're focused on building a customer-driven product team, and happy to be talking about that some more. Building a customer-driven product team is product management.
I'm excited to learn more about building a customer-driven product team, but even a bit more excited to learn about David's background. He says he has founded 5 companies, which is 5 more than most people. How did he do that, and what was his journey into entrepreneurship and product management?
I grew up in a house of 2 parents who immigrated to the U.S., and, like most immigrant families, kind of work 7 days a week, and I kind of grew up in that kind of small business environment. And I think that kind of rubbed off on me. And, since kind of as long as I can remember, I always thought about kind of building things and making things. And I'm kind of an obsessive reader and obsessed about learning how things work. And for me, starting companies and building products were all kind of the result of different obsessions that I would have on different topics. And, I'd obsess about learning something, and then I'd end up building something, and then from building something that would turn into a company. And it all starts with kind of that curiosity for me. My first startup was a long time ago, 1996, 97. And that was the first startup. I was a part of that founding team. And we built basically something that would look like Facebook today. We didn't know the term social network, so we created something that we called a community site. And it very much replicated some of the online communities that existed with news groups and with AOL and Prodigy and all these kind of early internet services back when you had to install them on your PC or computer to be able to dial into them. And so we built this community that turned into one of the largest, I think it was the second largest community site of its time. And we had millions of users on it. Our demographic were teens, from 13 to 18, although there were some older people on there, and we built all sorts of amazing products. From that, I kind of left at our height. We had just filed to go public. And of course, we all know that in 1999, the market crashed. And so that company never ended up going public. It ended up getting acquired years later, and that was called Bolt, BOLT.com. And so around that time, I followed my then girlfriend to Boston and had never even been to Boston before, and moved up to Boston and started to look around and kind of talk to people about different ideas and products, and kind of ended up starting my own company called Compete in 2000. And Compete was focused on online measurement. We started in November of 2000, which was after the bubble had popped. Not the best time to start an online measurement company because no one cared about the internet for a long time. And, lots of amazing experiences, lots of sleepless nights in those first 3 years, lots of people telling us that no one would ever do anything online but buy books like on Amazon, and no one would ever enter their credit card online, all sorts of funny things that you hear now, and we can laugh about it now, but it was pretty serious back then. In 2007, we were acquired by WPP, which is the largest marketing agency in the world, and I left at that point to go and start some other companies. Fast forward to starting company called Performable, and I started Performable in 2009, and we were acquired in 2011 by a company called HubSpot, which was a fellow Boston marketing software company, and we kind of knew each other for a long time. I knew the investors in that company, and we both wanted the same thing, and we were kind of headed in the same direction. So we kind of merged, and I went on to lead product. I was the chief product officer at HubSpot. Product was a little different at HubSpot in that I owned not only product management, but I owned design, I owned engineering, I owned the operations that it took to serve up the product, and built that team from about 50 some odd people to around 200 by the time I left, which was a few weeks before we went public. And I left with one of my VPs of engineering, and we went off to start a new company, which is the company we're working on today, which is called Drift. And at Drift, we're helping businesses kind of know, grow, and try to amaze their customers.
David has quite the resume. He started companies from scratch and led sizable product departments. Hiring the right people for product teams is such a highly debated topic right now. Why does David think focusing on people who are customer-driven is the key to success?
It's great to hear people talking about this. This is kind of a thing that I've been mildly obsessed with for a while now, definitely heavily since the Performable days, so since 2009, but even before that at Compete. And for, like most great things, for me, it was kind of a happy accident. At Performable, we started the company. We're running it kind of in a traditional way. I'd say, we were very early in kind of the lean startup world, and I used to give a lot of talks early on at different lean startup conferences. And so we were really focused on, the front side of things, which is the kind of the customer development side. And then the customer-driven side was, for me, a natural progression. We had started the company around this customer development process and trying to get to product market fit. And then we got to a point that we did get to product market fit. And now, because of our size, we accidentally stumbled into this thing where all of us as a team, everyone on the team, we were about 20 people, were doing support and supporting the customers directly. And which wasn't not easy for kind of traditional engineering teams, because engineers typically don't like spending their days talking to customers, but we did it out of necessity. And what I noticed during this process was that things that we had discussed internally, and kind of I was playing the product manager at the time and the CEO, and things that I would bring from the customer to the engineering team didn't always get done, and there was a lot of pushback. And I noticed that the engineers were implementing fixes for the things that I had brought up when they heard them directly from the customer. And kind of light bulb moment went off. The more that I watched the engineering team hearing directly from the customer, and the faster I saw them responding to the customer and doing things that in the past, would have taken a lot of drug deals and arm twisting and cajoling to try to get them to do, they were doing immediately because they had the autonomy and they had the freedom to go and solve problems that they were hearing about directly. And so we built our culture on this customer-driven concept. And then when we were acquired by HubSpot, we set off to see if we could scale this kind of idea that we had stumbled upon, because we were only 20 some odd people. Could it really work at scale? How would it look? And really, for the next 3.5 years, got to experiment and see how it worked. And, the short net is that it was the most amazing and productive product team that I've ever worked with. And it was a direct result of being customer driven, which we can dive into what the hell that actually means.
David incidentally discovered a wildly successful and scalable product development process in which one of the core feedback loops was directly between engineers and customers. Let's learn more about what this looks like.
For us, being customer driven meant and means today that everyone in the company is communicating with customers continuously and in different forms. So that some of that is in person, if we're lucky enough. Some of that is online. Some of it is via Skype, like we're speaking today. Some of it is from a Slack group that we have for product managers, which is the typical user of our product, or whether it is answering support via email or even getting on the phone. There's lots of different ways that we're communicating with customers. And not only are we all communicating with customers, but I believe that in order to have correct alignment, your incentives have to be properly aligned, right? And so we set up all of our metrics internally, both for the engineering product team, but across the entire company. to be metrics that are proxies for customer success. And so that we know that, if we're looking at these metrics, that the teams are going in the right direction, and we build a culture that gives the teams, especially the engineering and product and design teams, as much autonomy as possible, pretty much complete in deciding what they're working on, when they're working on it. Are they working on new features, bugs, infrastructure? What are they working on is totally up to them. How they work on that process, whether it's using a certain methodology, whether using a certain tool to record it, whether it's Trello cards or Kanban or whatever, the individual teams get to decide that on their own, and they have complete autonomy and control over that process. What we're looking at from a team standpoint is making sure that all of the metrics that we're looking at are transparent, and they are the closest proxies that we have for customer happiness and customer success. And that's how we know that things are going in the right direction. And so we don't have traditional things like roadmaps and version numbers and, a long kind of detailed out to-do lists and stuff like that.
Being customer-focused requires autonomy and being metrics-driven. But having engineers interface directly with customers is so foreign for most companies. How does that practice look at scale?
I'll give you the HubSpot example since that was, we're still in the early stages here. We're like a 10-person company, and that team was closer to 200 and got to cycle and refine this a bunch there. We built everything around having an engineering-led organization, and we built the engineering teams around this idea of having very small teams. In our case, I chose an arbitrary number, which of course everything arbitrary drives engineers crazy, and said like all engineering teams will be 3 people in size. And why 3? Only because I made it up, and we could, who cares? It's a starting point. We could refine from there. We tested all different kinds of sizes. 5-person engineering team, 7, 1, we tried all these things. For some reason, 3 was good. I think 3 ended up working because it was so small that the tech lead, who was the person who ran the team, so we had a tech lead and 2 engineers that worked for the tech lead, could manage 2 other engineers and not kind of devolve into becoming a full-time manager, right? So we didn't need them to become a full-time engineering manager. They could spend 80 to 90% of their time, if not more, coding. The team was small enough so it could be located together, and so the 3 people would sit around. And because it was so small and they sat together, in most parts did away with the need to have meetings and to have even daily stand-ups or any of the traditional type of meetings. The teams didn't need them. They were 3 people working together, sitting together, and it kind of did away with that. And so we had these 3-person engineering teams. The core thing for each engineering team is that the engineer had to own a complete customer-facing product. So we made sure the way that we divided all of our teams was that they owned a customer-facing product from, the presentation of that product down to the operations of that product. They owned the support of that product, meaning like if the product went down in the middle of the night, they were the ones getting paid. That didn't go to a third party, like an overnight team or a different team within the company. They owned it completely. And they owned the QA of their product. They owned the release engineering of their product. They owned the user testing of their product. They owned it completely. We paired up each of these 3-person engineering teams with a product manager. A product manager usually worked across many of these 3-person engineering teams. And then for each product manager, we had a designer who was dedicated. And we also had a product marketing manager who was dedicated as well. And so all of these people and all of these, whether it was the PM, the PMM, the designer, and the engineering team, all sat together. And so we made sure to co-locate them all to do away with the need for a lot of overhead and a lot of meetings. And that's how we, from a structural standpoint, kind of worked. For a long time, the organization was pretty flat. We didn't have hierarchy on top of those teams. And then over time, really towards when we started to get to the 200 phase, we added a second VP of engineering, a director, but really that helped out with recruiting. But all of those directors, the VPs, were supporting the individual contributors on the team. And the way that our model was always a servant leadership model, meaning the higher your title, the lower you are in the totem pole, and the more your job is to support the individual contributors and the customers above you.
really appreciate David carefully detailing this organizational structure. How did he manage to get buy-in and build a culture around such a process?
Company-wide buy-in is a good question, right? It's the question everyone asks. I'd say it's simple. The answer to all of those questions are simple answers, but like all great things, they're not easy to implement, right? So they're hard to actually implement. So let's say like something like having company buy-in. In reality, the answer is simple, right? It's having transparency, having accountability. So with autonomy, which we believe core to this principle is the autonomy that the engineering and product teams have, is accountability, right? There is no autonomy without accountability. I say autonomy without accountability is anarchy. That's something totally different. That's not autonomy. And so all the teams are accountable. They're transparent in the metrics that they are driving towards and the work that they're doing. And by doing that, little by little, you gain the support of the other kind of internal customers that you have, whether that's management, customer service, customer success, sales, marketing. Like you get all of their buy-in. One thing that we did, which really helped, was that each of those 3-person kind of teams and the product managers and the designers, we had metrics that measured them on customer success, which we could talk more about. That's one set of customers, right? That's your true external customer. But as valuable as those metrics are, we made sure that we were also measuring them on internal customers as well. And their internal customers were sales, support, services, marketing. And for all of those teams, we had shared metrics that the PM and the engineering team were responsible for, with a point person on each of those teams. So you'd say like email team, that's as an example, has these set of customer-facing metrics, and then they have these internal metrics that they are trying to move with their counterpart, this person right here who's in support, this person right over here who's in sales, that person in marketing, and they have to report on those metrics publicly as well. And so we make it kind of a shared system. And at first, it sounds simple, but it's, you can imagine it's not simple to roll out, and it takes time to see that it's working and to get buy-in. And as long as things are transparent and we have that shared accountability, it buys you a lot of freedom. And it bought us the freedom not to have things like roadmaps and version numbers and all the traditional and dates, things that are all in the traditional product management world. But so many of those things for us, the way that I would think about it is that those things are company problems. Those are not customer problems. Customer problem is not our roadmap, even though you may hear that from a sales objection or, version number. No one cares about a version number. What they care about is that they're being heard, that their feedback is taken into account, that something is being done because of that. And that's what we focused in on that velocity that we could have, and that speed and agility that we would have by giving the teams kind of ultimate autonomy.
Just because something is simple doesn't make it easy, David says. What have been some of the challenges he's come across while building customer-driven product teams?
Most of them, it turns out to be kind of new habits that we have to learn. And so that's the hardest part. And most of those are within the team themselves. First, engineers are typically, if they're experienced, they haven't come from an environment where they're communicating with customers. And so that's kind of your first hurdle. For us, over time, it became part of our culture. So we, maybe without even knowing it, we were self-selecting for the kind of engineers and product managers who did like that. And so that just kept reinforcing itself in the culture. Other habits like avoiding process kind of overhead. And, on the product management side and on the engineering side, we'd have a lot of pushback in the early days about wanting to introduce more and more process into the system. And, my favorite word was no. So I'd have to say no again and again. And they'd say, we need an infrastructure team because of this shared backend thing. And I'd say no. And they'd say, well, who's going to do that? Well, the teams have to do that. Well, the teams also own, the customer-facing product. And I'd say, correct. And they'd say, oh, so we have to do that too. But, Michael, wouldn't it be more efficient if we had a dedicated team that did infrastructure, and so that we got shared services, and, we had thousands of microservices at HubSpot. so that they could have one group focused on that. And theoretically, yes, but in practice, no, because those teams are not connected with the customer. And so they tend to drift into projects and into time spans that need a lot of overhead, need a lot of process, need a lot of management, because a lot of those, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have lived through this, never end up making it. That 6-month rewrite or that, we just have to rebuild this part of the infrastructure and then it'll be 10 times faster. Never works that way in practice. And so for us, our discipline was that we were going to be customer focused and everyone had to be building something that a customer could use. And if we had shared points, which we had hundreds, if not thousands, then we were going to make sure that the different engineering teams were communicating. And that part, the communication part, is the one that would come up all the time. So, engineers would say, oh, we need to hire a project manager. And I'd say, why do you need to hire a project manager? And they'd say, oh, I don't know what Michael's working on. And I'd say, did you talk to Michael? And they'd say, no. Why not? That doesn't scale. I can't talk to Michael. I'm busy. I'm working on, my product, this, that. And I'd say, no, you have to go talk to Michael. Oh, well, Michael's in our Ireland office. Okay, so send Michael an email. Oh, he's not going to read it, this, that. Oh, well, look, Michael posts every week on the wiki, our internal wiki, all the stuff that he's working on. Look, it's right here. Have you read this? No, I don't have time. The wiki's a mess. I can't search it. Okay. So it would just keep going. It was almost comical. I had this conversation hundreds of times with different engineers. And at the end of the day, I would have to say, no, we're not going to introduce a project manager just because you can't get up and talk to the person who's 10 feet from you. We have to build this organization and our culture around communication, and you guys have to figure out how to communicate. And we're not going to put in these things that I think most companies would just put Band-Aids into the system and then wonder why things are slowing down and why things are not getting done and why we're in meeting hell, every day. And it's because we've been not dealing with the root cause of the problem, which is communication. And so we would spend a lot of time making sure communication would happen. And, slowly, these things are slow. People would get it and they would change and new habits would build and they would communicate. And then all of a sudden, the need for these things would go away and happiness would increase. One thing that I didn't talk about was that our team was insanely happy. Our retention numbers for engineers and product people were kind of off the charts, even compared to the rest of the company. In a time today where, in the last 5 years, where, everyone knows that that's a major problem. And it was because we built this kind of culture that was happy and that had freedom and that had kind of purpose. And that came from this autonomy and kind of accountability that we introduced. But it was all simple and just not easy. It takes a lot of discipline, like most habits do.
Giving arguably the most profound insight to date on this show, David explains how introducing unnecessary process can create barriers to customer centricity and how autonomy ultimately leads to unprecedented retention and success. But I have to imagine that some process and strategy is necessary, even if it's not the traditional kind.
First, I don't set any roadmaps. What we would do is that myself, and this is all at HubSpot, and we do the same thing at Drift here today, but at HubSpot, myself and Brian, who's our CEO, would get together, and once a year we would, before the beginning of each year, we would set off and kind of come up with the themes for the next year. This is not a roadmap. These are themes, like very, very high level themes. Like we would like to be able to get into this business or this area or deal with this kind of problem, very high level, very far away from the product needs to do X, Y, and Z, or is it a product or is it not a product? But we would come up with themes. I would then communicate those themes to the different product teams, and then we would figure out goals for each of the teams on how would they try to drive towards fulfilling the themes for the year. And then after that, the teams were, all I cared about was looking at the metrics day to day to make sure that they were all talking to customers, iterating with customers, releasing frequently, and that customers were, both from our quantitative and qualitative kind of measures, were getting happier, were using the product more frequently, and retention was going up over time for the different customer types, the different cohorts, the different plan sizes that we looked at. I mean, we looked at it every which way but Sunday. We had 15,000 customers at that point, and so we could really slice and dice and look at all of those metrics. And as long as those things were moving, again, it sounds simple, but not easy. A lot of intervention has to happen to make sure when people get off course that they get back on course. That's all that mattered. The teams came up with their individual roadmaps, their individual timelines. The only thing that we pushed for was that they ship as soon as possible. And so, my answer to everything, I had a few answers that always came up. No, ship it, just ship it. That's a mural now at the new HubSpot office. Just ship it. I would just say it over and over. Our HIP chat room before we moved over to Slack, you would just type in just ship it and a rotating picture of my head would show up. Right? That's how frequently I would say the same thing. And I would just want the teams to ship daily. And we got to a point that our teams were shipping 500-600 times a day to production every single day. And that was the cadence that we were moving at.
I think I already know the answer to this, but I asked David if there was anything in between high-level themes and bottom-line metrics that kept product teams aligned and focused. Maybe OKRs or other KPIs?
No. I'd say yes and no. The teams I definitely had as an organization, we call them M-spots, which are our version of, OKRs that I was driving to for the year. But then for the individual teams themselves, no. For them, it all came down to those internal goals that we had and internal metrics that we had for each team and their counterpart in support, sales, services, marketing, and that those were moving in the right direction. And then the metrics that we had for both quantitatively and qualitatively for customer success and retention. And those were the metrics that we were looking at. And, for the bigger things that dealt with kind of new things, new areas that we were going into, we would look at like the themes. We didn't have dates or, timeframes on those. Usually we did have an annual conference. So we have this conference called, HubSpot has this conference called Inbound, and it's once a year, and it's typically in August or September. And we didn't really have deadlines for the teams to be shipping their products there, but we would have thousands of marketers, thousands of customers show up there. And so, of course, naturally, all the teams wanted to make sure that their stuff was shown on the big stage and that the customers got to see it right at this event. And so they kind of set their own deadlines. And we did this thing where even with Inbound or kind of any releases, we worked with marketing so that we always had separate tracks for real releases and marketing releases. And a problem I see most companies do is that they tie those things together and they make them mean the same thing. And we separated those things, meaning that we may have released a feature 6 months before we ever talked about it from a marketing standpoint. And the reason we would do that is so that we would have time for that product to be out with customers, even if it was a subset of customers. In some cases, it could be a subset of 50 beta customers, 100, 2,000, whatever the number was, and sometimes it went into the thousands, using that product. And better yet, not only using that product, but becoming successful with that feature, and then giving the product marketing team enough time to go back to those customers. And so then when we had a marketing launch, they could have case studies, examples, real data backing up kind of the launch. And so we had this discipline of always separating the two things. And I'd say, for the people listening, that's a common mistake I see most people do, which is take the marketing release and the product release and make them the same. And we all know that just leads to disaster.
David constantly references metrics that individual teams and engineers used and were guided by. What's an example of one or two?
So for the engineering teams and their internal customer, let's say in support, easy one where we would have the support team and we would, instead of giving this job to the product manager or to the engineering team, we would put it onto the internal customer and say, hey, support, we want to get to the problems that, this team wants to fix the problems that you're seeing the most. We pledge to do that work, but you need to do the work of organizing and prioritizing and doing all that kind of stuff. And so what they would do is for each of the teams, they would come up with a list of, for support, in this example, here are the top call drivers that we have for support for your product. And we'd look at that, week over week, month over month. And the teams had to work with support to drive down the top. In the beginning, we just chose the top 5, and then it grew top 10, whatever the number was, the top N call drivers over time. And so we were closely looking at those call drivers and seeing that they were getting driven away. And most of the support call drivers for most products that I've seen are actually user experience issues. They're infrequently are they major bugs, or outages. They're really, a lot of them are like, how do I do X? Or what do I do when X happens? And so they are user experience issues that need to be worked out more than anything. And so we'd have them have those shared set of metrics. For, let's say, another internal customer like sales would be studying their win-loss kind of data. So which deals did they win? Which ones did they lose? They would study the ones that they'd lost, and then they would say, these are the features or functions that they're hearing from customers that we lost or prospects that they're talking to. And then as a sales team, they had to prioritize those issues for each of the product teams. And then we committed to work with them to deal with those issues over time and add those features and kind of functions. And then for true external customers, we would do things like the standard stuff that probably everyone listening does. Response time of that application. Is it getting better over time? Outages for that system. How many critical outages have we had? How many soft outages have we had? How much downtime have we had for that app in the last week, month, year? Then we would look at kind of for each of the cohorts that we would be looking at, both by plan size, by persona type, we would look at what was their frequency of use for the different features and functions of that team's product. So is it getting better over time? Are our best cohorts using the product more over time? How are they using it? What are the best combinations of products? Are they using the 3 best features that we think are correlated with lower churn? And so we would look at those metrics and kind of measure those over time. Then we would have qualitative ones, which were, NPS of that customer segment for that product type, feedback that we were getting in the app, outside of the app, things that they were asking for from a feature or function standpoint, like ideas that they were submitting and voting up. All of those things were examples. There were many, many, many others that we looked at, but these are kind of gives you an idea of the type of metrics that we were looking at for each team.
Of course, the entire episode is about customer-driven product teams. So what were some of the best practices David developed with regards to generating reliable and actionable feedback and insights from customers?
I'd say, customer support is definitely one of them. I'd say the best one came from user testing. And so our best insights came from user testing. And so the way that I think about user testing is that a lot of user testing and kind of user research has to do with getting into the daily practices of the customer. Some of them have some overlap with the product that you're building, but most of them should be you observing customers in their natural state and the natural problems that they're having, irrespective of the product that you're building, of just trying to understand that. We would get those insights a lot of the time by visiting customers, which is the best, because we'd want to see their office, who sits next to them, what's in there. If they were in a cubicle, what's in their cubicle, what do they have printed out that's hung on the wall? What does their browser look like? What are their favorites? What's on their desktop? What's their homepage on their app? Just really understand, kind of like a researcher, what are they doing? What does their day look like? And the reason that I care so much about that is because rarely do you get that information when you ask someone pointed questions about features or functions or things that they need. A lot of times we found that the information that we were getting when we asked them directly was kind of aspirational. There were things that they thought that they wanted or that they dreamed of. But, when we would look at what they actually did each day, in most cases, it had kind of zero overlap with what they actually did each day. And we learned way more by having those interviews and watching what they were doing and seeing their daily practice and seeing how they had to go through 5 different apps to do something or download something in Excel. Excel was the gold for us. It's always been for me, kind of building the type of software that I do is like, as soon as I see a customer or prospect use Excel, I know we're onto something. That's where they're doing kind of something that we can help them do more efficiently. And it's something that almost no one's going to tell you about because it's so boring that to tell someone that, oh, I download this, I export this, and I put it in Excel, and I sort it this way, and I do that, and then I put it here, and then I do this, and I re-upload it here, and then I put it in PowerPoint. And, like, who's going to talk about that? It's so boring. But that's, for us building software for marketers and for salespeople, that's what they're doing all day long, right? But they're never talking about it. And so we would observe that. And then in kind of classic user testing that we would have all of our teams do each week, they had to be mocking up. The designer and the PM would be working on getting ahead of the engineering team, mocking things up, going into user testing from day one, from, sketch on a napkin to first mock-up to prototype to then soliciting a group of beta users out of the customer base who would then work, be the first alpha users and beta users, and basically getting things in this process of constant iteration from the very beginning. And so we learned a lot through that user testing process, and we learned things that seemed great that didn't end up being great. An example of that is that, designers and PMs will work with customers and kind of stumble upon a new kind of user experience pattern that was better for the customer, that seemed to work better, but that when implemented didn't lead to customer success or happiness. And the reason for that was that for a lot of our customers, they had built habits around the existing patterns. And even though, we had a pattern that we thought was way better, kind of the overhead, the mental overhead of relearning a pattern cost more than the benefit that they would get out of this new pattern. And we kind of learned that the hard way, kind of implementing things and new kind of patterns when existing patterns were well adopted within our base.
David has made the case for customer-driven product teams and the truly impressive results it can lead to. Next up is the benchmark. Let's see how David reflects on the next series of questions we ask all interviewees to ask themselves.
So how do I eat my own dog food? Great question. It's hard. It's kind of a habit that we all have to teach ourselves as product leaders, as product managers, as builders of things, to make sure that we're all eating our dog food, and not only making sure that we're eating it, but knowing when we should and when we shouldn't be eating our own dog food. I'd say early on when you're building a product, in a lot of cases, you're lucky enough to be the right customer type for that product. But over time, even if you are the ideal customer type in the early days, as your product grows and it takes on new customers and it evolves, you soon start to realize that you are not the best customer of your product. And so for that case, we've always relied on building beta and alpha tolerant customers in our base that we can test with and that we can make sure they're dog fooding our product. And the other advantage that we've had is that we've built traditionally B2B software, and so we could usually find the perfect customer outside of the product team, and whether that was sales, marketing, services, support, and make sure that they were always our alpha customer. We're always using kind of early versions of our product, making sure that we were dog fooding it. How do I get out of the office? For me personally, I make sure that I have earmarked in my schedule a certain percentage of my time that I'm always out talking to customers and to prospects and learning from them. I try to organize these meetings to happen in person because I want to see the customer in their natural environment. And if I can't get it in person in their office, then I will try to do it over coffee or over a walk or over lunch, because I want to get them in an environment where their guard is down and we could get them talking about things. For product teams and engineers on my teams, I've always had them just kind of reach out, and part of their daily workflow is talking to customers and testing them and dealing with support issues that are coming up and making sure that everything that they're doing is driven by the customer. What am I reading right now? So many books. I'm kind of obsessed with reading. I started a podcast recently called Seeking Wisdom, and in it I talk mostly about the stuff that I'm reading. I've read 2 books recently. I just finished one, which is one of the best books that I've ever read. And that book is called When I Stop Talking, You'll Know I'm Dead. And that is written by Jerry Weintraub. And if you don't know him, he was a famous Hollywood producer, produced Ocean's 11 and Ocean's 12 and so many of the movies that you know. And before that, he was the manager and promoter of Elvis Presley and Led Zeppelin and kind of endless list. He's kind of Hollywood royalty. Even though he's in entertainment kind of outside of our world, there's so many lessons I think that all of us as builders and creators of things can learn from that book. Highly recommended. And right now I'm reading several books, but one of them that I'm finding very funny is called Living with a Seal. And it is by Jesse Itzler. It's a funny story. You'll have to read it. And in it, he had founded the company called Marquis Jet. So he talks a lot about kind of the creation process in there, which is relevant for us all. And his wife is actually Sarah Blakely. And if you don't know her, she is the founder and creator of Spanx and is one of the youngest female billionaires. And so he talks about her a lot in there too, and a lot of lessons on how she started that business and how she built that product. So although both books have nothing to do with product management, there's a lot of overlap in the ways that we think about things and the products and the kind of day-to-day stuff that we do. So a recurring product management nightmare that I have is when teams are not customer driven, when they have relapses, and we all have relapses, and they start getting inside of their heads. And I have this problem too. So it's a discipline. And we start forgetting about the customer and we start inventing solutions to the problems that we see, although none of us are the actual customer. And each time I have to kind of stop us or stop myself and remind ourselves that we're not the customer and we need to get outside the building and we need to ship as soon as possible because we need to find out how much of what we're building is wrong. I kind of have this belief that everything that we create and every idea we have is wrong, and we need to get it out into the world as soon as possible to figure out how much of it is wrong and how to correct it.
Listeners can find out more about David and Drift on Twitter @dcancel, at davidcancel.com, and from his podcast at seekingwisdom.io. That's our show. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, this is Mike Fishbein from Alpha.
Do you want more product management tactics and research? Subscribe at thisisproductmanagement.com to receive the latest updates from this podcast.